In this video, I want to talk about the Lasso tool. Now, the Lasso tool is very much like your marquee selection tool, except that rather than drag out a predetermined shape, such as a rectangle or an ellipse or a row or column of pixels, you can drag out your own selection just by drawing it right on the screen. So it's extremely intuitive, very easy to use. Now, there are some things to consider in terms of its options. They're very much like the options found under the marquee selection tool. So you have your basic selection, which is just your new selection button up on the far left side. If you drag this out, that means each time you drag, you're making a brand new selection. If you click this over to add, then the next time you drag, you're adding to the current selection. You can set it to subtract, and you are, of course, removing away from a selection, or you can set it to intersect, and you'll only keep where two selections actually intersect through one another. So extremely straightforward. Just like with marquee select, you can feather a selection. So if we set this to something like, let's do something really high, like 30 pixels, and I'll set this to new selection. I'll just drag out kind of a small, vaguely circular shape. And if I make my paintbrush bright red and try to paint inside, you see what that did. We have this nice kind of soft fuzzy area because of that feathering. So we'll go ahead and undo that. Now let's jump back over to our lasso tool again with the L key, and I'll set that back down to 0. We can also choose whether or not we want the end result to be anti-aliased. It's generally a good idea to do this, but you don't have to. For instance, if I was to make a lasso selection up here, like so, and I moved that, so I just grabbed the move tool, or you can hit the V key, and currently my background is this nasty brown color. Let me set that to bright white so it's a little easier to see what's going on. We have nice smooth edges here. If I do something similar, of course I can't make the same selection, with anti-alias off, and I move that, if you look really closely, and depending on how big your video is, you may not be able to see the difference. So let me zoom in a little bit. Here you can see the smoothing on the left and how chunky everything is on the right because of the lack of anti-aliasing. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Z a few times to undo all that, hit Control-D to deselect, and we'll go back to our lasso tool. Finally, once you have a selection, you can refine its edge, and this has all of the standard options that we have seen in earlier versions of the refine edge selection. It just allows you to control the edge detection if you need to, and you see as I adjust, well, I'll go ahead and leave Smart Radius off. As I increase this, that's just adjusting the edge of that selection. We can smooth out the selection if we want to, and you can see that getting softer. We can apply some feathering if we want to soften on the outside. We can boost the contrast, which is really only going to be noticeable if we increase our feathering. So there's no contrast, and of course there's high contrast. We can shift the edge away from its original position, or we can crush it in a little bit. Now if I boost our feathering a little, that becomes a little easier to see. And then, of course, we can adjust the output, but for decontaminate colors, we're not going to see a tremendous amount of change. So we'll go ahead and just kind of leave that down. So I'll cancel that out. But that is a quick look at the Lasso tool. Now, that's just the basic Lasso tool. You don't really have to use the basic Lasso tool. This guy's job is to allow you to just draw out some pixels like so. Underneath it, though, we have the polygonal Lasso tool. Now, the polygonal Lasso tool does essentially the same job, but it allows you to click individual points instead of dragging, and you can make some nice geometric shapes in the same fashion. Now, aside from that one singular fact, it has all the exact same options as the regular Lasso tool, so it's just whichever one you'd like to use. I find that if I'm doing 3D work and I'm doing things like UV layouts, I often find myself reaching for the polygonal lasso tool because I can create nice selections that perfectly mimic the polygonal layouts of my geometry, which is very, very cool. Finally, we have the magnetic lasso tool. This is pretty nifty. Let me zoom in here to the head of our little jellyfish. And what this does is as I draw around something, Photoshop tries to make an intelligent guess of what it is I'm trying to lasso. So if I get a little bit closer, if I keep my brush, the radius of my brush kind of within my jellyfish, now I've just clicked once, so all I did was just click the mouse. Photoshop is carefully analyzing those pixels and trying to guesstimate what it is I want to select. So really quickly, I was able to select just the head of my jellyfish, and you can see how that works. Now, there are some settings for this, and basically what you're doing with these settings are, well, let me be clear. The first several settings are what you've already seen with the other lasso tools. You have your new selection, you can add to a selection, remove from it, intersect, you have feathering, anti-aliasing, but you have things like width, contrast, and frequency, and these are totally new. You won't see these anywhere else. Width is going to control the overall width of that brush that you're using. So notice as I click that up, our little our circle that looks kind of like a brush gets bigger. This is the area within which Photoshop is going to look to try to figure out what it is you really want to select. So generally, the tighter you can get away with leaving this, the better, because Photoshop won't have such a hard time figuring out what you're trying to lasso. Next, you have a contrast percentage. This will set a contrast tone that Photoshop will look for to figure out where those path points are going to be placed. So if you leave this set pretty high, it's going to require a pretty high contrast thing, or contrast image, so two really highly contrasted areas for Photoshop to know where to place those points. And if you leave it really low, then Photoshop might get a little bit confused. So you probably will find yourself having to play with this. Though in this case, we're pretty lucky because we're going from like this brilliant blue to a brilliant orange, and Photoshop's like, hey, no big deal. I see exactly what you're trying to select. Next, you have frequency, and what that's going to do is control how dense those path points are going to be dropped, because if you hadn't noticed, as we're clicking, it's not just making a regular selection. You'll see this curve being dropped down with little points being added along the way. And what that is a Bezier path that's being drawn on the fly as you trace your mouse, which is actually very cool. And we'll carefully drag back through here. Oh, and I tried to close that and I failed. So if I did something like this in the real world and I was like, oh no, I didn't mean to select in there, I'd probably just grab like a regular lasso tool and grab add to selection and then carefully drag across there, and then in through here, and add that back in. So there you are. So let's go back over to Magnetic Lasso once more. And that's pretty much it. Now, you do have the ability to turn off some tablet pressure, or turn on and off some tablet pressure. And I wasn't using my tablet for that. But if you switch that on, the amount that you push down will control how big that brush gets. And then, of course, you have Refine Edge, which we've already demonstrated. So that is a rundown of the lasso features available within Photoshop. More often than not, I find myself using probably the polygonal lasso for a lot of my things. If I need it to be rounder, I'll just click a few more times. I just don't trust the shakiness of my hand. But don't write off the magnetic lasso. It's extremely useful for a lot of different circumstances. That's going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.